Hello English students and welcome to Excel at English, which is a channel devoted to helping you achieve excellence in your analysis of English language and literature texts. In this lesson we will be exploring critical perspectives as part of a series on the context of The Handmaid's Tale. Some of these videos will be aimed specifically at AQA English language and literature students doing A-level in the UK, but they could be generally useful to anyone wanting to study the text or for whatever reason. Please check the playlists on the channel page for other video lessons in the series, and if what you're after isn't there, then subscribe or put a request in the comments for me. So let's think about critical perspectives to begin. Critical perspectives are different ways of looking at texts, and they approach texts from different ideological standpoints. They're sometimes called a critical lens, to use the metaphor of a magnifying glass. And I guess when we adapt a different critical perspective, we look for different things, or we look to interpret different ideas within a text. There are four main critical perspectives. There are more than four critical perspectives, but there are four main ones that I like to teach. And all of these can be relevantly applied to The Handmaid's Tale in some way. Marxist perspectives view texts in terms of a class struggle between the entitled classes and the dispossessed classes. For psychoanalytical or Freudian perspectives, interpret texts in terms of the way they represent subconscious desires. They tend to interpret features such as dream sequences. Feminist perspectives look at texts in terms of the struggle for equality of the sexes, and they identify things such as male norms and gender inequality in texts. And finally, postmodern perspectives. Postmodernism is a challenging concept, but generally speaking, postmodernists reject facts or truth in favour of interpretation, and that leads to some interesting effects in texts, particularly in fragmented texts or texts that kind of break stylistic rules or can be quite radical. There is a separate video available if you check the channel page that looks in more detail at these critical perspectives and how they can be applied to some of the core texts on the AQA English Language and Literature course. It's also not a bad idea for your wider reading to have a look at these ideologies, the Wikipedia pages on these ideologies, because they aren't just critical perspectives that apply to literature. They are broader ideological perspectives, ways of looking at the world, and they influence everything. These four ways of looking at the world influence all of our media. They influence our economics, they influence our politics, they influence our language, and so they're well worth knowing something about. Okay, the rest of this lesson will look mostly at the way that Atwood has spoken of her own texts. And Atwood is a dystopian writer she doesn't just write dystopias, but she's written many other dystopian works which are very wildly different from Handmaid's. But her dystopian writing does have some rules to it, and she's spoken about some of the principles of her own approach to writing dystopias. One thing is that she chooses to reject the label of science fiction for her works, even though they're futuristic, and in a sense they could be interpreted as science fiction, but she instead prefers the term speculative fiction. And the quote here is her justification of what speculative fiction means. And it's her way of saying that in a speculative fiction, the things that take place are things that are possible or conceivable. She explains it here. She says speculative fiction means a work that employs the means already to hand. So her novels explore things that we are already capable of doing and are therefore, I suppose, a little bit more realistic. So there are no teleporting, time travelling, really fantastic, far-fetched aspects to Atwood's dystopias. Atwood has also coined the word Ustopia, which is a kind of a synthesis of dystopia and utopia, and she claims that each contains a latent version of the other, which is a way of saying that dystopia and utopia is a question of perspective, i.e. one person's dystopia can be another person's utopia. What one person from their perspective conceives as a perfect or ideal society could be a nightmarish hell for someone from another perspective. So Atwood uses this word Ustopia as a way of kind of capturing the fact that dystopias are a question of interpretation, a question of perspective. On a side note, this is a kind of a postmodern approach or a postmodern attitude to take, in that it rejects a kind of an objective truth and instead focuses on the way that a particular perspective interprets a situation. So we could connect this to the quote from the commander in The Handmaid saying that better never means better for everyone, he says. It always means worse for some. And I guess the word Ustopia Atwood is using to capture the idea that if you were to rewrite The Handmaid's Tale as the commander's tale, you might actually be writing a utopian novel from the perspective of wealthy, well-educated, powerful, middle-aged white men. Actually, yeah, Gilead looks pretty utopian, really. They have the ultimate freedom, they have the ultimate power. So this word Ustopia forces us to look at dystopia and utopia as a question of perspective. A couple of suggestions for your wider reading. Oryx and Crake is the first book in a trilogy which look at of Atwood's, a dystopian trilogy written by Margaret Atwood, looking at genetic manipulation. It's radically different from The Handmaid's Tale, but it's also a very, very interesting read, and it follows those two concepts there, the concept of speculative fiction and the concept of Ustopia. Ustopia and this idea that actually dystopia and utopia is a question of interpretation is familiar in other dystopian works, although it is Atwood's own term. Huxley's Brave New World is a dystopian text, a central dystopian text, one of the formative or canonical dystopian texts that I guess it presents itself as a perfect society. There's also a great dystopian novel for young people called The Giver, which on the surface is a perfect society. Seems like a utopia, but really, depending on your perspective, could be dystopian. What has Atwood said herself about The Handmaids? Well, you can read widely here, as I mentioned before. She interviews regularly and she speaks very candidly about the text, The Handmaids, and the writing process and the ideas that have influenced her, especially seeing as Handmaids has enjoyed its own kind of revival recently with the TV series and with certain political events. It would be a great idea to construct your own simple biography of Atwood. I'm not going to give you any facts from her life, but it's certainly worthwhile knowing a little bit about who she is and where she comes from. But here below there are quotes that she has made related to or on the Handmaid's Tale. I'd like to draw your attention particularly to the one on the bottom left of your screen there, where she says, "I made a rule for myself. I would not include anything that human beings had not already done in some or other time or place." And she's repeated this claim, talking about the novel in different interviews and at different times. The claim here is that The Handmaid's Tale is really based in social fact and not fiction. Very similar to her kind of claim about speculative fiction and this idea that the technology used should be believable. Well, actually, the way that people treat each other, or particularly the way that women are treated in Gilead, is based on facts. And Atwood is very, very good at supporting this. If you mention or in interviews where she's been, where people have proposed to her particular events from the novel, she's been able to talk, she can talk very, very convincingly and persuasively about particular examples from history or even from modern society in which some of these things have happened. There are some terrible, terrible things that happen in The Handmaid's Tale, but they are all based on things that have happened in some time or place in human history. There are some other quotes there that are well worth you paying attention to. At this point I would probably pause the video and check those quotes and perhaps write down any key quotes that you think would really help your study. Finally then, let's think about contemporary relevance of the text, and we mentioned this earlier, talking in one of the earlier videos, talking about the growing relevance of 1984. 1984 has kind of grown into the modern world by becoming more relevant and not less relevant. And this appears to be happening as well to The Handmaid's Tale. The political conflict that we looked at in the third video on context, the progressive liberal values of feminism versus the traditional and religious values of the new right, that conflict is still the defining conflict of American politics, and it's still a conflict that's also played out on a global stage. Atwood has become a kind of intellectual figurehead for these progressive values, and she speaks very persuasively for feminism and progressive political values generally. But this is the side that perhaps, depending on your perspective, is losing the fight, particularly in American politics at the moment, where the new right or these traditionalist movements still have great power over American politics, and the conflict over Roe versus Wade and abortion laws, this is a kind of a political freedom that is constantly under threat. It's still a highly controversial aspect of American society. The modern media-based movements like Me Too, sorry for the typo there, people, these are a response against the kind of sexual exploitation, and politics itself has become very sexualized. I won't make political comments myself, but if you look at the poster there, Make Margaret Atwood Fiction Again, if you think about that as a text and what that represents, it's a pretty interesting summary of the state of American politics. So much so has this text returned to relevance that the uniforms themselves have become a kind of a political protest symbol, and are often seen at protests in the US. The headline there in the text box at the bottom, that women are threatened with up to 30 years in prison for having a miscarriage under the new abortion law in Georgia, which is a state in the south of the USA. What can you say? Can it happen here? Well, there are certainly many people who believe that The Handmaid's is coming true. So, in summary, there are different critical perspectives that can influence the way that you interpret this text, and researching them can help you evaluate the text in context. Also, we've discussed a couple of distinctions that Atwood makes, the distinction between speculative fiction and sci-fi, and her hybrid term Ustopia, which makes dystopia and utopia a question of perspective. We also discussed some of the things that Atwood has said about the text herself, including the rule that everything included has happened before, and we've touched briefly on the contemporary relevance of this novel and how it appears to be getting more resonant and more powerful within contemporary society as the years go by. So that's all for this video lesson. If you think this was useful or valuable, then please show your appreciation by liking the video, leave me a comment or a request. You can check the channel page for other videos in the playlist, and please subscribe so that you will be up to date when I put new content up. Thank you very much for watching Excel at English, and good luck with your studies.